All right, good afternoon, class. Getting this a little later than I had hoped to this afternoon, but better late than never, as they say, right? I am going to carry forward some conversation, some presentation that I was making in class today, but because of some of your comments and are lingering a little longer on certain points, I wasn't able to get through everything. So I'll do that here. I'm going to just click. And as you all know, you can pause this at any point if you feel like there are holes or gaps in your notes that you didn't get to when we were talking in class today. And just to remind us, we're talking about the High Middle Ages and how there were some, slow yet persistent developments that are happening during this period that are serving to set the stage for what we might call Europe's eventual successes. So those in particular are serialization. We talked about urbanization. Sorry, getting ahead of myself here. Urbanization, and then the rise of universities really early in the second millennium current era. So let's get after it. I feel like we covered this notion of the feudal manorial system that had come as a sort of, I guess we could say, an alternative to centralized rule following the dissolution or the decentralization of Charlemagne's rule, his brief rule as the Holy Roman Emperor of mainland Europe. In the centuries that follow, Europe's going to experience a rather decentralized, scattered form of political authority. And the feudal system is, as I was suggesting, in large part a response to the lack of hierarchy or centralization. And it was a system that oftentimes enters into being when there is a lacking centralized power. Okay, so moving on to serialization, this is probably the most revolutionary or deep-seated change that hits Europe during the High Middle Ages. And again, I've used the term revolution, but really it's a much slower, plodding, methodical set of developments. So we see this emerge at first in northern France and England, which isn't a huge surprise because these are the parts of Europe that are being sort of revisited and perhaps scrutinized a little more closely, because with the Battle of Hastings and the emergence of William the Conqueror, who has multiple claims to the French and English thrones, we start to see the northern part of mainland Europe become a new sort of focal point or center of European developments. And serialization is it's actually a big concept, so I have this as a term in red, but really what it refers to is the collective changes to agriculture that start happening. And you'll see, as this slide will indicate, it has a number of different facets. But we could start with crop rotation, and if we go back to pre-1000 current era, we would have noted that the plow is a relatively new, or particularly the deep earth plow is a relatively new element of European or Northern European agriculture, and it has to do with the really dense, moist clay soils of the Northern European landscape. And so this plow is a game changer, as we read in Lynn White's essay. But even in the immediate aftermath of the plow was a big help, because soils could be they could be turned to a deeper level of the soil horizon. Pardon me. But even so, eventually, the nature of agriculture is that if you're planting similar crops, those similar crops are going to leach similar nutrients from the soil, and over a period of time, whether that's 3 years or 15 years, those soils are going to be depleted of the nutrients necessary to grow things like wheat or barley. Well, the big change that starts to happen, European agriculture had been slash and burn, and also had a rotation where usually about a third of the soil was left to fallow each year, meaning it was left undisturbed so that the soils could regather nutrients and have, every third year off, so to speak, to allow the soils to replenish themselves. But the Northern Europeans started to discover that if they practiced a special crop rotation, where they planted grains one year and then say a ground cover like clover, some sort of maybe feed for their livestock the second year, and then the third year planted tubers like turnips or something like that, say, that they could have a system where 100% of their land was in production, while it was also restoring the nutrients, because each of these different crops demanded something but also gave something back to the soil. So the crop rotation, not super exciting, but this is, as you can imagine, it's going to increase by at least 33% the productivity of the Northern European soils. So that's a big part of it. Animal energy. One of the things that starts to happen is Northern Europeans shift their dependence for animal energy in terms of, hauling plows and other agricultural implements. There's now going to be a shift from oxen to horses, and in other cases cattle. But in both of these instances, they're moving to a faster, stronger, more agile beast of burden. And so this creates greater efficiencies and the ability of farmers to produce or to prepare and sow and then harvest their property more efficiently, is also contributing to a greater output. Add to this the introduction of iron technology. This starts to happen. Lynn White was talking about how the deep plow was going all the way back to like the 8th century in Europe. But the big developments that happen a couple hundred years later is that Europeans are going to start putting iron tips on their wooden plows, and so this will allow their plows to last longer. So more plows underground, fewer plows in the shop, so to speak, greater efficiency, greater productivity. It's also worth noting that iron will allow for more agricultural implements, things like hoes and scythes and other useful iron equipment that also adds to the overall productivity of agriculture. Finally, we have water wheels and windmills. These become useful natural forms of energy. The water wheel becomes particularly evident. In Great Britain, there's going to be a water wheel for about every 35 households by the year 1100. And so these water wheels are being harnessed to do things like grind grain. They are going to be used to bat wool. So, wool is produced in part by sort of the violent striking of these fibers together to pack them more densely. Other applications, they'll be used to saw, water wheels will be used to saw wood. They'll be used to sharpen and polish iron as well. So all sorts of uses, and these things are coming together, and you can't really see this, it's probably behind my picture, but it says population and surplus. So the ability of Northern European agriculture to create a greater food surplus allows, again, slowly over time, from 1000 to 1400 Common Era, we're going to see a much greater ability for European society to specialize. There will be more artisans and more people who are, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, coopers, which are barrel makers, masons, which are brick makers and bricklayers, so on and so forth. So this is important. And to speak to that, from about 1000 to 1100, so in just a 100-year period, the population of Europe is going to almost double from about 40 million to 75 million. Again, these are rough estimates, but they tell you that a tremendous amount of development and gears are turning toward Europe's future. And then I put here crossing the line because, pardon me, crossing the line notes that this is a powerful moment in history, because if you're a former farmer, which is pretty much what everyone in Northern Europe was at this time, you can imagine the difficulty in the choice of crossing over from your agricultural past to your artisan present and future. There's something of a gamble there. You're putting your faith, you're putting your destiny in someone else's hands because you have sufficient reason to trust that they can provide for you while you are going out and now exploring a new future as a artisan. So with that, that's just something that can help us appreciate the dilemmas that people would have faced during this period of change. So serialization and its favorable impacts upon Europe's population is going to have another consequence, and that is greater urbanization. And so I guess I have to correct myself here. From the year 1000 to 1350, Europe's population is going to reach 74 million people. And that's up from about 40 million just a few centuries before. So some pretty dramatic transformations happening. As the population goes up, so does the urbanization of high Middle Age Europe. This means the formation of cities, which are oftentimes an outcropping of population density. And these artisans that are moving in from an agricultural past to a specialized artisanal present and future are sort of they're the catalyst around this transformation to an urban society. It's also worth noting that that manorial conversation that we started out, the feudal order at the beginning of my comments today, kings are granting special charters. If you think about a charter school today, it's a school that's given sort of certain space and exemption to try sort of innovative or different approaches to education. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work so well. But charters in this context are special exemptions that kings grant to individuals who are going to form a town or a city. And so the people want to have reassurance from the king that if they go out and try this new venture, that they're going to have his blessing, that he won't meddle, he won't tax them excessively, that he will honor the land upon which they are building this city. And so these charters become, again, catalysts of this new urbanization process that's happening in Northern Europe. And it's actually very central to some of the successes that will follow in the coming centuries. So in these urban contexts, there start to be markets, which are at first just very rare and periodic events. But over time, they will become daily phenomena. And that makes sense if you think about it, because if people are no longer growing their own food, and they are specializing on things like making shoes, in becoming sawyers, producing wood and lumber. If they are specializing in making barrels, specializing in making bricks, so on and so forth, butchering meat, making cheese, what have you, they're going to need to get their other food from elsewhere. And so the markets become this central institution in these early towns and cities, which are also being driven by the growing population of Europe. And these markets, as it says here, they start off temporary, but they become permanent daily enterprises. Money, we start to see coins as early as 1000 current era, but money and minted coins had not been around prior. You'd have to go all the way back to the Roman Empire to see the presence and prevalence of coins in the European society. And it just creates overall a sense of specialization. Again, not super dramatic at the time, but these are putting in place the characteristics that will ultimately serve Europe in a fairly powerful way. And let me go back to this and mention those chartered cities are an absolutely critical moment in Northern European history, partly because they're going to give rise to this new group of people that are known as the bourgeoisie. So if you've read any Karl Marx and Engels, you know that the bourgeoisie are a critical group of people by their social science examination. So the bourgeoisie, and if you think of it, the bourgeoisie are also known as the burghers. They're a class of people. They're an enterprising group of people who form sort of the initial urban experiment in scattered places throughout Northern Europe. Think about it, burghers, Pittsburgh, Knoxburg, Hattiesburg, all these towns, even in the U.S., we sometimes have burg is the end. It's the sort of initial burg. It's the place that the burghers went to, and they are going to form this bourgeoisie class. And this class is going to be a critical group of players in the coming world as it even makes the transformation from the early modern period to the modern period. And then we are also going to see the emergence by 1200, and we could even say a little earlier than that, of major cities like Paris. It has a population of 80,000 people as early as 1200. And among these artisans that are gathering in these cities, they start to form what are called guilds. And guilds are sort of like an early example of a workers' union. The guilds gather, so there'd be a guild like, say, the Cobblers Guild, and cobblers are people who make shoes. And the Cobbler Guild would get together, and this group of people would sort of control entry into their line of work. So there would be agreements among the members of the Cobblers Guild about how many hours they would work each week, about how much they would charge for their shoes, about who can enter into the distinguished realm of the cobbler fraternity, so to speak. And so they stressed and were able to exercise both economic and social power through this this formal institution. They also would do things like help each other pay for burials of family and loved ones, and so they had kind of even some personal levels, almost kind of like a church of sorts that they would enter into. Okay, we'll get on here. I'm mindful of time. The rise of universities. So in the 11th and 12th century, we know this is all going on in the back of in the background of what's going on here. We have the Crusades, and part of the challenge that we mentioned, part of the reason that Pope Urban declared the First Crusade was some of the instability and hardship that was building up, the pressure that was building up within Northern Europe, partly because of the growing population and the fact that new generations of Europeans didn't have anywhere to go with their, you know, with their talents. They didn't have any land because the land had been distributed and was becoming smaller and smaller and more and more difficult to make work. So universities start to rise out of this, and we were talking about primogeniture the other day, and a couple things are going on here. We have surplus population, but there's also surplus wealth that's happening from the specialization that's taking place all throughout Europe. And so the surplus wealth is going to help support the rise of a new institution known as the university, which actually probably goes back as far as the 11th century, starting in places like Paris and then also in Bologna, Italy. And so the surplus wealth and surplus populations help create this. Sorry, let me go back. And I just want to note that if you're a family at this time, and let's say you have 3 sons, and I'm going to reference sons because daughters in this patriarchal society would be, their lives would be determined mostly by the accomplishments and career choices of their husbands, unless they didn't marry off, which of course would have been a separate set of concerns for a family of that time. But the process of primogeniture featured that the eldest son would by and large inherit the land that family had in its under its ownership and control. And then from there were a few different options that a second, third, fourth son could explore, but one would be to pursue a career in the church. And then now we have, as the rise of universities, the opportunity for a son, assuming he was coming from a wealthy enough family that controlled enough land, or that had enough profits from its specialization in some sort of artisanal sector of the European economy, they would have enough money to send their second, third, or fourth son to the university. So education in the early universities was done, it was carried out in Latin, and it's worth noting that not everyone spoke Latin. So a really important part of participating in higher education at this time would be to either know how to speak Latin or to learn how to speak Latin. And that would be in contrast to the local dialects and Romance languages that were spoken by the common people, so French or English or Spanish or what have you. Latin was sort of the language of religion and education at this time. So your education, if you were to be sent to one of these universities, would have consisted of a liberal arts education, and it had a few different levels. The lowest level of the trivium would be your education in grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And so this was primarily these 3 things, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, would allow you to sort of persuade and become a, perhaps a skilled merchant or a bureaucrat of some maybe low level within Northern Europe. The quadrivium consisted of learning astronomy, arithmetic, let's see, what am I missing here? Music, and then could have been geography. And I want to say it's something with a G, but it's not coming to me right now. I might have to revisit that with you in class. And then finally, at the highest level of this liberal arts hierarchy, You would, if you were to get your master's degree, you would get that in theology, church law, or medicine. So in some ways, the university was also a way to pursue a route toward a future in the church. Okay? So my final comment on this slide is scholasticism was the prevailing way of thinking, and I think I've mentioned this before, but scholasticism is a mindset that was evident in the earliest European universities, that all of the known knowledge, all of the learning that needs to be learned has already been learned. I mean, it's already been presented. The universities existed to explore the sort of ancient and early modern wisdom that had already gone before. So there would have been a tremendous emphasis upon people like Aristotle and Aquinas. There would have been some emphasis in mathematics on algebra and some of the skills and disciplines that had come into Europe via the Arabs, who incidentally had translated a lot of the Greek texts that then allowed for the retranslation of some of the Western classics back into Latin. So a fairly complicated story, complicated route that these things traveled. Books were very expensive, and paper, this was in an era before paper. Paper is just about to be introduced to Europe, but at this point, the most important text would have been translated onto parchment. Think like animal skins. You see some parchment here. In fact, I think this is the Magna Carta, and the Magna Carta comes along at year 1215. It was written on parchment, not paper. Books are very expensive, and booksellers, that was a pretty lucrative industry where educated people would literally be copying from one document a new version of that document, so there could be yet another copy of it in circulation. But you can imagine how long that would take. These are in the days before the printing press. Crazy. And then I'll just end with this. These are some of the things that come into the universities. Again, complements of the Islamic world, and paper is a huge part of that. That comes into Europe via the Muslims who have taken paper and paper technology from the Chinese. Medicine. And then I have here Christians' aversion, meaning that even as these new ideas are coming in, the Crusades and the Holy War, there's sort of a cultural reluctance to, or maybe a cultural envy, so to speak, to accept all of this important, valuable learning from the Islamic world. So with that, I will stop. Thank you.